My mother made her toast before the soup had even cooled. That was the thing I noticed first, the impracticality of it. We had been seated for perhaps 3 minutes. The table was laid the way it always was at Christmas. The good china, the candles in the silver holders my parents had received as a wedding gift and used exactly twice a year. The small folded name cards my mother had written out in her careful cursive, even though there were only 7 of us and we had been sitting in the same chairs for 30 years. I had driven up from the city that afternoon. 2 hours and 40 minutes, motorway the whole way. A podcast about interest rate forecasts keeping me company through the flat, gray December light. I arrived at 3:15, which was when I had said I would arrive. I hung my coat on the 3rd hook from the left in the hallway. My hook. The one I had claimed at age 9 and apparently never relinquished. And walked into the kitchen to find my mother and my brother Daniel already deep in conversation, laughing at something, her hand on his arm. She saw me and smiled. "Clara, darling," then turned back to Daniel to finish the sentence. I poured myself a glass of water and waited. By the time we sat down, it felt like a normal Christmas. My father, Robert, at the head of the table, a little quieter than usual. Daniel's wife, Sasha, beside him. Their 2 children at the end closest to the kitchen. My Aunt Patricia and her son Marcus. And Victor. Victor had been invited for the 3rd year running, ever since his wife passed. He sat to my father's left and said very little, which was exactly what Victor always did. My mother stood up. She lifted her glass, and the table quieted. And she looked around the room with the expression she wore when she was about to say something she had been composing in her head for quite some time. She spoke for nearly 4 minutes. I counted internally, the way I count most things. She talked about the year that had been. She talked about gratitude. She talked about how lucky she felt to have her family around her. And then she looked at Daniel. 3 years ago, she said, this family faced something we don't often talk about. We came close to losing something that your father spent 30 years building. And one person stepped in. One person showed us what it actually means to love your family. Not from a distance, not with advice, but with presence. With action. She raised her glass toward my brother. To Daniel, she said, who pulled us back from the edge. The table raised their glasses. My father's eyes were bright. Sasha squeezed Daniel's hand. Even Marcus, who was 17 and constitutionally allergic to sincerity, lifted his glass. And then my mother looked at me. It was a brief look. A second, maybe 2. But I have always been good at reading the specific weight that a look can carry. Some of us, she said, without raising her voice, without any particular sharpness, as if she were simply observing something obvious, keep their distance and call it wisdom. Daniel was actually here. She sat down. The table applauded. I held my wine glass steady. I set my face into something mild and unremarkable, and I let the moment fold into the next moment, the way all moments do. I filed it away. That is what I do with things I cannot immediately use. I store them. The soup arrived. Everyone began to eat. Before I go any further, if you've ever been the one who actually did something and then sat at a table while someone else received the credit, leave a comment below. I'd love to know I'm not the only one. And if this is the first time you found this channel, subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Now, back to the table. Let me tell you something about being the serious one. In my family, that phrase had a very specific meaning. It was not a compliment, though it was never quite delivered as an insult either. It occupied that particular territory that certain family observations always do. The space where something is said so often, across so many years, that it stops feeling like an opinion and starts feeling like fact. Like geography. Like something that had simply always been true. Clara is the serious one. I heard it first when I was 7, at a cousin's birthday party, where I had declined to play a game I considered poorly structured. I heard it again at 14, when I chose not to perform in the school talent show. I heard it at university, when I studied economics instead of something with a human face on it. I heard it at my firm's Christmas party one year, when a colleague of my father's met me for the first time and said, puzzled, "But you're nothing like Robert described. He said you were the serious one," and then looked embarrassed, as if he had given something away. What serious meant in my family's private language was this: cold, contained, missing some essential warmth that other people carried naturally. Not cruel. They never suggested cruelty. Just somehow lacking. A table with an unlit candle. I am 37 years old. I am a senior investment analyst at a mid-sized firm in the city. I work with pension funds, with institutional portfolios, with the kind of numbers that do not forgive sentiment or imprecision. My colleagues respect me. My clients trust me. I have been called many things in my professional life. Rigorous, sharp, occasionally intimidating in meetings, but no one has ever called me cold. Because in my professional world, the particular quality I have is understood as an asset rather than a deficit. I notice things. I read patterns in data before they resolve into anything other people can see. I hold a position with patience when others want to react. I do not mistake noise for signal, which is perhaps the single most important skill in my field, and also, I have come to understand, the single most misunderstood quality in a family. My father's company was called Farrow & Sons, which was an odd name given that my father had 2 daughters before Daniel came along. But the name had belonged to the business for 2 generations before him, and Robert Farrow was not a man who discarded tradition lightly. It manufactured precision components, small, load-bearing parts used in industrial equipment. Not glamorous. Not the sort of thing that made for exciting dinner conversation. But solid, reliable, the kind of business that sustains a family across decades, if you run it carefully. My father had always run it carefully. He used to send me the quarterly statements. "For a second pair of eyes," he would say, which was partly an acknowledgement that my training gave me a useful perspective, and partly, I think, a way of maintaining a connection across the distance between us. The geographic distance of the city and the home, and the quieter, harder-to-name distance that had always existed between us, simply because we were both people who expressed care through action rather than declaration. And in a house full of declared feeling, that particular register often went unheard. I read every statement he sent me. I filed them, I tracked the trends. I noticed the shape of what was happening before it became a crisis. The receivables were lengthening. The margins on the core product line were compressing. There was a supplier contract, one large, badly structured contract, that was quietly bleeding the operating reserves. I saw it in the spring of that year. I did not say anything, because my father had not asked for commentary, only for eyes. And I was waiting to see if the numbers would correct themselves. They did not correct themselves. When I look back on that year, I think about all the moments when I saw the warning signs and said nothing. What would you have done if you had seen a crisis coming in someone else's business? Would you have spoken up or waited like I did? Leave a comment and tell me. I read all of them. Tuesday evening, November, 11 o'clock at night. I remember the precise quality of that hour because I had been working late. I often worked late, which was one more data point my mother filed under serious. And I had just made a cup of tea I had not yet drunk when my phone rang with my father's number. He called me rarely. We spoke, but usually by text, by email, by the occasional Sunday call that lasted 20 minutes and covered weather, work, the garden, and little else. An 11 o'clock call from Robert Farrow was not a thing that had ever happened before. I answered on the second ring. Dad. Clara. His voice was quiet. Not distressed in any theatrical way. My father did not do theatrical. But there was a quality to it that I recognized from a place I could not immediately name. And then I placed it. It was the voice of someone who had been holding something carefully for a very long time and was very tired. He did not rush into it. He asked how I was. I told him I was fine. He said that was good. And then he said, almost conversationally, "The company's in a bit of trouble." I sat down. I pulled the quarterly statement from the most recent folder in my mind. I had read it 6 weeks earlier, and I began running calculations, quietly, while I listened. He explained it the way accountants explain things to clients who don't want to hear it, with understatement, with qualifications, with the careful language of a man who has spent 30 years not alarming people unnecessarily. The short version was this. The supplier contract had created a shortfall that had cascaded. Payroll was covered through the end of the month, but not beyond. The bank had reviewed their position and were not inclined to extend further without security my father did not have to offer. He had spoken to several contacts about bridge financing. Nothing had come through. We might have to let people go, he said. Before Christmas. I knew what the company employed. 63 people. Some of them had been there for 20 years. I had met several of them at the company's summer party one year, a long time ago. A woman called Margaret, who ran the accounts receivable. A man called Pete, who had worked the floor since before I was born. "I'm not asking you for anything," my father said quickly. I needed to tell someone. Your mother is worried enough. Daniel is doing what he can, but he doesn't know the full picture. I just needed to tell someone who would understand what I was actually saying. I understood what he was actually saying. I sat with it for a moment. The tea was cooling in front of me. The flat was very quiet. "Let me look into some things," I said. "Clara." "I'll call you tomorrow, Dad. Get some sleep." I hung up. I sat for perhaps 30 seconds with the dead phone in my hand. Then I opened my laptop. I had a savings account that I had been building for just over a decade. The flat I had never bought, the wedding I had never planned, the sabbatical I had never taken. They had all contributed to it. In the way that a life lived with discipline and without particular extravagance tends to accumulate. £340,000. Not wealthy by the standards of the city I worked in, but substantial. Money that represented choices, and the absence of choices. Money that was mine, clearly and completely, with no obligation attached. I ran the numbers for approximately 45 minutes. This is not a metaphor. I sat at my kitchen table and I actually ran the numbers. I pulled up the company's last 4 quarterly statements. I cross-referenced the payroll obligations against the supplier debts. I modeled 3 scenarios: a minimum intervention, a moderate intervention, and a full coverage with buffer. The minimum would buy perhaps 6 weeks. The moderate would carry them through to March, which was long enough for the client pipeline Daniel had been building, which was genuinely good. Daniel's client work was genuinely good to convert into revenue. The full coverage would clear the critical path entirely and leave the company on stable ground. The number I arrived at was £280,000 to close the payroll gap and settle the 2 supplier debts that were most pressing. I added a buffer of 15% because I have never once in my professional life regretted a buffer. The total came to £322,000. I looked at that number for a while. I thought about the flat I had been saving for. I thought about it in the abstract way. You think about a thing you have wanted for a long time. It exists in your mind as an idea, a shape, a someday. I thought about it with less grief than I might have expected. Then I opened the transfer portal for my savings account. The company's main account details were in an email my father had sent me 2 years earlier with the quarterly statement attached. I still had it. I navigated to it. I typed in the sort code and account number. I entered the amount. In the memo field, I typed Investor Bridge, no repayment required. I looked at the memo for a moment. Then I pressed send. The confirmation came back at 1:47 in the morning. A reference number, a processing date, a balance that was now significantly smaller than it had been an hour before. I closed the laptop. I washed out my tea mug, which was cold. I went to bed. I did not lie awake for a long time, which surprised me, and did not surprise me. The decision had been made the moment I had understood what my father was actually telling me on the phone. The rest was implementation. I told no one. Not my mother, not Daniel, not any of my friends in the city, of whom there were a small number who understood me well enough that they would not have made it into something larger than it was. I told no one because the money was the point. The payroll was the point. 63 people going home to their families at Christmas with their wages. That was the point. The credit was not the point. Victor called me exactly 1 week later. Victor Lamb had been the company's accountant for 20 years. He was 61, methodical, careful with words the way a surgeon is careful with instruments. I had known him since I was a teenager. He had never called me at work before. "I see it," he said when I answered. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," I said. A brief pause. "Is there anything you need me to do?" "No," I said. "Just make sure it goes where it needs to go." Another pause. Then, very quietly, "I'll make a note." He hung up. I did not think about that conversation again for 3 years. With the bridge in place, things moved quickly in the way that financial crises, once resolved, tend to move quickly. The payroll went out on time, the supplier debts were settled. The bad contract was renegotiated. That was Daniel, actually, and I want to be fair to Daniel here, because in the months that followed, he worked hard. He knew the clients. He knew the company's value proposition in a way that was instinctive and social, which are skills I do not have and do not pretend to. He brought in 2 new accounts before Easter. He restructured the sales approach. He was present, which was true, He was there in the way that I, in the city, running my own work, could not be. He gave a speech at the company Christmas party that year. Someone filmed it on their phone and sent the clip to my father. And my father, in the way he sometimes did with things he was proud of, forwarded it to me without comment. I watched it at my kitchen table on a Thursday evening. Daniel was good at speeches. He had warmth in front of a crowd, a particular ease that translated through even a shaky phone video. He talked about the year they'd had. He talked about the team. He raised a glass to his father, which made the room cheer. "We found the support we needed," he said, near the end. "And we're still standing." He did not say where the support had come from. I watched him grinning at the camera while the room applauded, and I sat with that phrase for a moment. We found the support we needed. And I thought about what I had expected him to say. I could not honestly say I had expected him to announce it. To say, "My sister wired 300,000 pounds, and we would not be here without her." That would have been strange. That would have required him to know in a way I was not sure he knew. I told myself the money was the point, not the credit. I closed my laptop and made dinner. In the months that followed, the company continued to stabilize. My father sent the quarterly statements with a slightly different quality to them. Still brief, still no commentary, but I thought I could detect something. Gratitude, maybe? Or the residue of a difficult thing that had been survived. I wasn't sure. Daniel's name came up more often in family conversation. My mother mentioned his client wins. She forwarded his emails to me sometimes. "Isn't it wonderful what he's doing with the business?" She bought him a watch for his birthday that year. The nice kind. The kind she chose with care. She talked about the company as if it were Daniel's company, which it wasn't, though he was more present there than I was, which was true. I told myself the money was the point. I told myself this with the regularity of someone who is beginning to know that the thing they are telling themselves is not the complete truth, but who has made a decision to say it anyway. Because the alternative is a kind of grief that is not useful. I am not good at grief that is not useful. I am very good at filing things away. I became very, very good at filing this particular thing away. Christmas again, 3 years after the transfer. The pudding was warming in the kitchen. The main course plates had been cleared. My Aunt Patricia had organized that. With the efficiency of a woman who understands that post-main course momentum is critical to a successful Christmas dinner. The wine was at its 3rd hour. The children had been excused from the table. The conversation had slid into the comfortable shallows of family occasions. Something about a cousin's new job, something about the roadworks on the A road near my parents' house. Daniel was holding court at his end of the table. This was his natural habitat. The post-meal warmth, the loosening of collars, the moment when stories get told. Our aunt had complimented him on the company's recent expansion into a new market. She had read about it somewhere, she said. Or heard about it from a friend who knew someone. And Daniel was deflecting the compliment with the particular grace of a man who enjoys deflecting compliments because he knows it makes him look better than accepting them would. "I can't take credit for all of it," he was saying. "The team is extraordinary." It really is. I was watching his hands when he said it. He had a way of spreading them, palms out when he was being magnanimous, which I had observed as a child and never quite stopped noticing. And then Victor shifted in his chair. It was a small movement. Victor was always still. He sat with the stillness of someone who had spent decades listening carefully in rooms where other people talked. I noticed the shift the way I noticed most things. Not immediately, but with a half-second delay, the way a signal takes a moment to resolve into data. He set down his glass. He looked at my mother, then my father. Eleanor, Robert. His voice was quiet, not soft. Victor's voice was never quite soft. It was the voice of a man who had learned that precision of volume was more effective than volume itself. I've been meaning to say something. During the annual audit this year, I found something I should bring to everyone's attention. The table quieted. This happened in stages. Daniel's hands came down. Patricia stopped reaching for the water. My father looked up from his plate with an expression I recognized. The particular alertness of a man who has learned that unexpected announcements at family dinners are rarely announcements of good news. My mother said, lightly, "Victor, this is Christmas dinner." "I know," Victor said. "I've been waiting for the right moment. I think this is it." He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and removed a folded piece of paper. The table was entirely still. Before Victor unfolds that paper, I want to tell you that if you want to keep building your English listening skills, there are useful resources and links in the description below. Now, back to the table, because that piece of paper is about to change everything. Victor unfolded the paper slowly. He was not being theatrical. Theatricality was simply not in Victor's register. He unfolded it the way he unfolded everything. Carefully, completely, without waste. He set it on the table near the centerpiece, the arrangement of holly and white candles my mother had ordered from the florist and positioned herself that morning. He smoothed it flat with the back of his hand. It was a bank statement printout. Not the whole statement. A single transaction, printed on one sheet of paper, with the account header at the top and one line of data in the middle. The paper was slightly aged, not brittle, but with the particular quality of something that has lived in a file for some time. I could read it from where I sat. Date? A Tuesday in November, 3 years prior. Time? 1:47 a.m. Amount? £340,000. Recipient? Farrow & Sons Limited. Name on the sending account? C.R. Farrow. That is my name, Clara Rose Farrow. The middle name my mother gave me, after her own grandmother, which I had always slightly disliked. And now, looking at it on a bank statement, on a Christmas table, found I minded less than I remembered. Memo. Investor bridge. No repayment required. The bridge loan that saved the company, Victor said, did not come from an outside investor. He spoke to the table at large, quietly, in the voice of a man reading a document into the record. It came from this account. He slid the paper toward the center of the table. No one spoke. Daniel reached for it first. He picked it up with both hands. I watched his face. He had the coloring of our father. Fair, readable, the kind of face that does not hide things well, regardless of its owner's intentions. The color left it in stages, starting at the jaw. He read the paper twice. I counted the seconds between the first pass and the second. Then he set it down, without looking up. My mother reached across and picked it up. She held it at arm's length. She needed her reading glasses, which were in the kitchen, but she refused to acknowledge this and squinted instead. Her expression as she read it was something I had not seen on her face before. It was not guilt. It was something more complex than guilt, more layered. The expression of a person encountering information that requires them to revise a story they have been telling themselves for 3 years, and finding the revision process in real time, uncomfortable in a way they had not anticipated. My father did not reach for the paper. He stood up. He stood up from his chair at the head of the table and walked around it with the slow deliberateness of a man whose legs are doing their job while the rest of him catches up. He stopped beside my chair. I looked up at him. He was looking at the paper that my mother was still holding, but his eyes were not reading it. He knew what it said, I realized. He knew what it said, because of course he did.
He had always known, in the way that people know things they have chosen not to examine too directly.
He put his hand on the back of my chair. Around the table, the room reconfigured itself in the small, specific ways that rooms do when something is shifted. My Aunt Patricia had put down her wine glass. She was looking at me with an expression I did not immediately know how to classify, somewhere between shock and something that might have been, if I gave it time to settle, admiration. Her son Marcus had stopped the lazy circling of his dessert fork. He was 17 and too old for this dinner in all the ways that 17-year-olds are too old for family dinners. But the paper on the table had made him young enough to be interested again. Daniel's wife, Sasha, was looking at her husband. Not at me, not at the paper, at Daniel. It was a particular kind of looking, the kind that has history behind it. As if this paper confirmed something she had wondered about, but never asked. And Daniel had picked up his wine glass and was holding it the way I had been holding mine all evening. Steady. Necessary. Victor folded his hand on the table and waited. He had waited 3 years. He could wait another few moments. My mother spoke first, because my mother always spoke first. This must be some sort of mistake. She set the paper down, and she looked at me. And there was something in her face that I had the charity to read as hope. The hope that I would tell her it was a mistake, that there was an explanation, that the story she had built and lived in for 3 years was still structurally sound. I set down my wine glass. The glass met the table with a small, precise sound. I placed it carefully. I looked at my mother. I did not raise my voice. It's not a mistake, Mom. The table listened. I could feel the listening as a physical quality, the particular density of air in a room where everyone has stopped breathing for a moment. I wired the money the night Dad called me. November, 3 years ago. I'd seen the quarterly statements. I knew what was happening before any of you said it out loud. When Dad rang, I ran the numbers, and I transferred what was needed. I pressed send at 1:45 in the morning. I paused. Not for effect, because the next thing I was going to say required more precision than the previous thing, and I wanted to be sure I had it right. I didn't do it for credit. That is true. I didn't want recognition. I didn't need a toast, and I'm not asking for repayment. The money was the point, and the company is standing, and 63 people went home to their families that Christmas with their wages. And that matters to me, more than this dinner. My father made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound of a man whose chest has released something it has been holding for a very long time. Daniel opened his mouth. I raised one hand. Just one hand, palm forward, the small gesture of a person who has decided how much space this moment is going to take. Not now, Daniel. He closed his mouth. My mother looked at me. She had the expression of a person standing at the edge of a very large apology, looking down into it, understanding for the first time how deep it is. I did not press the point. I had made the one statement I needed to make. I had said the true thing, the precise thing, without embellishment or performance. The room had heard it. Victor had heard it. He had, of course, heard it. He had arranged for it to be heard. And now he sat with his hands folded and his eyes calm and said nothing at all, because nothing more was needed from him tonight. The silence lasted long enough to be complete. Then I reached for my wine glass again, and I took a small, considered sip, and I looked at the centerpiece, the holly, the white candles, one of which had begun to list very slightly in its holder. And I thought about precision components, about load-bearing parts, about the small things that hold larger things upright. I stood up. I did not make a speech of it. I pushed back my chair, and I stood up. And I went to my father. He was still standing beside my chair. He was a tall man, Robert Farrow, though age had begun to work on his posture, in the way it does with tall men, a gradual negotiation with gravity. I reached up and kissed him on the cheek. His skin was warm and slightly rough, the way it always had been. He took hold of my arm with both hands. His grip was firmer than I expected. He held my arm the way you hold something when you are afraid it will leave before you have said what you need to say. And when I looked at his face, I saw that he did not have the words yet, that they were somewhere inside him, where language had not quite reached. "Merry Christmas, Dad," I said. His grip tightened for a moment. Then he let go. I went to my mother. She was still seated, which surprised me. Eleanor Farrow had always been a woman who managed situations by moving through them, standing up, rearranging, redirecting. The fact that she was sitting was its own kind of information. I leaned down and kissed her cheek as well. "Merry Christmas, Mom." She said nothing. She put one hand briefly over mine where it rested on her shoulder, and then I straightened and picked up my bag from the floor beside my chair. I did not look at Daniel. I did not trust what my face would do if I looked at Daniel, and I was not interested in discovering it at this particular table. I said goodnight to Patricia, who stood up and hugged me in a way that conveyed more than I had expected, something compressed and warm. I said goodnight to Marcus, who said, "Okay, yeah, goodnight." Clara, in the register of a teenager who does not have the vocabulary yet for what he has just witnessed. I went to the hallway. My coat was on the third hook from the left. I put it on. I found my keys. I let myself out of the front door and pulled it closed behind me with the specific care of a person who will not be accused of slamming. The cold was immediate and clean. December night. Clear sky. The particular quality of darkness in a residential street where the Christmas lights in every window provide just enough ambient glow to navigate by. The path from the front door to the car was 12 steps. I counted them. I drove back to the city. The motorway was quiet at that hour, the post-dinner, pre-midnight lull, when everyone has arrived where they were going and no one is yet going anywhere else. The Christmas lights on the gantries above the lanes blinked their regular, patient patterns. I drove at a steady speed, slightly below the limit, the heating on, the radio off. I thought about very little. This is a skill I have developed across many years, the ability to think about very little when thinking about very much would not help. I passed the building. This was a residential development I had been looking at 3 years ago, before the transfer. 8 floors, good windows, underground parking, the particular neighborhood I had decided I wanted to be in. I had gone to view a flat on the 5th floor twice. I had been very close. I passed it without stopping. I drove to my own building. The rented flat I had lived in for 4 years. The one with the view of the railway viaduct.
The one that was mine, in the way that rented things are never quite fully yours, but which I had made as fully mine as I could manage. I pulled into the underground parking space and turned off the engine. The car was very quiet. I sat in it for a moment. I sat in that quiet for a long time. And if you're still with me right now, thank you. Subscribe so you never miss a new story.
I'll be right here when you come back. Robert Farrow drove to the city on the 28th of December. He arrived at 11 in the morning, which I knew he would, because my father is a person who respects working hours even when no working is happening. He texted me from the road. On my way, shouldn't be more than 2 hours. Don't go to any trouble. I made coffee. This was the full extent of the trouble I went to. He sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where 3 years ago, I had opened my laptop at 11 o'clock at night and run the numbers. And he looked around my flat with the expression of someone seeing it properly for the first time, though he had visited twice before. Perhaps he was seeing it differently. Perhaps the numbers had given him a new scale. He put a check on the table between us. I looked at it. I did not touch it. Dad. It's not the full amount, he said quickly. I know, I can't. It's what we have liquid. It's a start. We'd want to... Dad, I said it again, more quietly. I don't want it. He looked at the check. He looked at me. He had the expression of a man who has rehearsed this conversation and found that reality has not cooperated with the rehearsal. I know it was never about the money, he said. I know that. That's not... I know what it's not, I said. I'm telling you, I don't want it back. The memo said no repayment required. I meant the memo. He sat with that for a moment. Why didn't you say anything? He asked. Why didn't you tell us? I turned my coffee cup in my hands. Because the company needed the money. It didn't need a story about where the money came from. He was quiet. Then, that's very like you. I know, I said. I mean it well, he said. I always have. I want you to know that. Whatever your mother... He stopped. I've always known who you are, Clara. I haven't always said it well. I looked at him. He looked older than I had been seeing him, or perhaps I had been seeing him correctly all along and only now noticed. The specific way that people age when you stop looking at them as background and start looking at them as people. You can keep the check, I said. But I'm not cashing it. He seemed to understand this, which surprised me a little. He folded the check and put it back in his pocket. We talked for 2 hours. About the company? Doing well, he said. Better than it had been in years. The new market Daniel had identified was holding up. About my work, I told him more than I usually did. About his garden, which he had been neglecting and planned to address in the spring. Before he left, he mentioned Victor. He said, my father said, getting his coat from the hook by my door, that he'd been waiting 3 years to say it. He told me he almost said something last Christmas, but the moment wasn't right. He shook his head slightly. I never knew he knew. He knew, I said. He kept the record. That's what Victor does, I said. My father nodded. He put on his coat. He stood at my door for a moment, with the expression of a man who still has things to say, and not quite the language for them. And then he put his arms around me, briefly and firmly, the kind of hug that is communicating something specific, even if neither party can articulate what. I hugged him back. After he left, I stood in the kitchen and looked at the table. Then I picked up my phone and called him. He was probably still in the lift. And when he answered, surprised, I said, "I'll ring you on Sunday. We should talk more." "Yes," he said, and I could hear, even through the phone, that he meant it completely. I started calling him more often after that. Sundays, mostly. It became a habit, which is the best form that some things can take. The letter arrived in the first week of January. I knew Daniel's handwriting. It had always been larger than you'd expect, slightly slanted. The handwriting of a person who had been left-handed as a child and was made to switch. The envelope was addressed to me in that handwriting, a first-class stamp posted from the town where he and Sasha lived. I opened it at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning, before work. It was handwritten, 3 pages, front and back of the first 2, a few lines on the third. He had not typed it and printed it. I noticed this, and it meant something, though I could not have said precisely what. You do not write 3 pages by hand to someone you are not taking seriously. He wrote that he did not intend to make excuses. Then he explained, which was different from making excuses, though only slightly. And he was self-aware enough to acknowledge the difference and to say he was going to explain anyway because she deserved to know. And here he was, calling me she, and then crossing it out and writing you, which told me he had drafted this at least once. He wrote that he had not known at the very beginning. When the bridge arrived and the crisis passed, he had assumed, they had all assumed except Victor, that the investor my father had mentioned to him vaguely was a professional contact, someone from the industry, someone who had put in money for a return that hadn't materialized. He had not thought to ask too closely. The company was stable, there was work to do, and Daniel had done the work. But within a few weeks, he wrote, certain things had started to land differently. The amount, the memo language. The fact that the investor had never followed up, never asked for anything, had never materialized as a person in any meeting or phone call. He had started to do the arithmetic. He had not asked Victor. He had not wanted to ask Victor. I knew, he wrote. Not with certainty, not at first. But I knew. And I let it become a story, because the story was easier. The story made me the person who had held the company together, and that was a person I liked being. I told myself you didn't need the credit, that you were fine, that you wouldn't even want it. I was wrong about all of those things. I let Mum make that toast, he wrote. Near the end, I sat there and let her say those things about you, and I didn't say anything. And I would like to tell you I didn't know what to say, but I did know. I just didn't say it. He did not ask for forgiveness, which I thought was the most honest thing in the letter. He said he understood if I needed time. He said Sasha knew. He had told her the night of Christmas dinner, and she had been, he wrote, not surprised. Which tells you something about how transparent I apparently am to the people who know me well. He hoped I was all right. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it along its original creases and held it for a moment, thinking about what it was. A reckoning made private and specific. A person looking at themselves clearly and deciding to put the clarity on paper and send it. That takes something. I was not certain I would have done it if the positions had been reversed. I am better at silence than Daniel is at honesty, and it is possible that neither of these qualities is as virtuous as it feels from the inside. I did not write back immediately.
I put the letter in the drawer of my bedside table, the narrow one, the one I use for the things that matter. There are not many things in that drawer. My passport, a photograph of my father and me, taken at my university graduation. The only photograph of the two of us, where we are both looking at the camera and both smiling, which happens to be a photograph I like very much. A letter from my first employer, offering me the role that started my career. The letter from Daniel went in there. I would write back. I knew I would. But I wanted to wait until I had something precise to say, rather than something merely responsive. And the difference between those two things was worth the time it would take. My mother started calling more often. This was itself a kind of statement, though it was never stated. She did not ring me and say, "Clara, I owe you an apology." I have spent years attributing the warmth I value to your brother and the coldness I fear to you. And I was wrong, and I am sorry. And I would like to start again. That would not have been Eleanor Farrow. Eleanor Farrow expressed things sideways, through action, through the texture of small gestures accumulated over time. It was, I realized slowly, not unlike the way I expressed things, through precision and presence rather than declaration. Perhaps that was always the resemblance we had refused to look at directly. She rang on Tuesday evenings initially, then Tuesdays and Thursdays. She asked questions about my work, real questions, the kind that required more than one sentence to answer. The kind that meant she had been listening to my previous answers and retained them. She asked what I was reading. She told me at length about the garden renovation she was planning, which was the kind of topic she had not previously offered me. Perhaps because she had assumed I would not be interested, which was fair enough, given that I had never indicated interest, which was perhaps my own contribution to the distance. We were, in other words, beginning to try, both of us, at the same time, without discussing that this was what we were doing. Because neither of us was naturally inclined to discuss the fact of a thing when we could simply do the thing. The birthday gift arrived in February. My birthday is the 14th, which means it regularly gets absorbed into the general disruption of Valentine's Day and tends to receive less attention than it might otherwise. My mother had never been a natural gift giver. She knew the theory of it, that you should observe what people liked and remember it. But the translation from theory to practice had always been slightly approximate. I had learned not to expect too much from my birthday. The parcel that arrived was wrapped carefully. Inside was a book. It was a recent work on behavioral economics, specifically on the intersection of cognitive psychology and financial decision-making. Not a popular science overview, but a serious academic text, the kind I read for professional reasons rather than leisure. I turned it over, read the back, checked the author, someone whose work I had cited in a paper I wrote 2 years ago. I could not imagine how she had found it. Then I remembered. 18 months ago, on one of our Sunday calls, my father's Sunday calls, which had by then extended occasionally to include my mother, I had mentioned the name of a researcher whose approach I found interesting. I had mentioned it in the context of something else entirely, a news story we had been discussing, and it had taken perhaps 30 seconds of the conversation. I had not expected anyone to retain it. She had retained it. Across 2 years and 18 months of forgetting to apply it, she had retained it, and she had found the book. And she had posted it to me in time for my birthday. I sat with the book in my hands for longer than was strictly necessary. Some families give their love in installments.
That was the thought that came to me. Some families are not built for the large, declared gesture, the toast at the table, the sweeping speech. The moment that lands in the room like a stone in still water. Some families operate in small denominations. The Tuesday phone call, the precise gift, the grip on the arm that says what the mouth cannot. I was learning to count these. The account between my mother and me, I did not know if it would ever balance. I was not certain that balance was the right word for what I was looking for, or even the right concept. You do not balance an account that has been running for 37 years, not with a phone call and a book, and the tacit acknowledgement of something that neither party has yet put into direct language. You do not balance it in a season or a year, but you can begin. You can begin to keep track, which is the first thing any serious accounting requires. You note what comes in. You note when it comes, and how, and whether the amounts are changing. You wait for the pattern to declare itself. You do not mistake noise for signal. You do not close the books prematurely. I put the book on my shelf, in the section I kept for work-adjacent reading, between two other texts I valued. I stood back and looked at it there. Then I went to my kitchen table and opened my laptop, and I wrote Daniel a letter back. Not a long one, but a real one. I told him I had read his letter twice. I told him I appreciated that he had written it by hand. I told him I was not interested in relitigating the 3 years, because the past is a record, and records do not change. I told him I was more interested in what came next. I told him he was good with clients and with the company, and that these were genuine skills, and I had genuinely never doubted them. I told him the credit for what happened was something that could be held by more than one person, without diminishing either. And then I told him that I hoped he and Sasha were well, and that I would see them at Easter if the plans held. I signed it, Clara. Not love. We were not there yet, and I did not want to rush the currency. But not nothing either. I sealed the envelope. I put a first-class stamp on it. I took it downstairs and posted it that evening. On the way back up, in the lift, I thought about the flat in the building I had passed on the motorway. The 5th floor. The good windows. I thought about it without grief, which was new. Or perhaps not new, but more clearly felt than before. Some money buys things you can touch. Some money buys things that take longer to name. I went upstairs. I made tea. I drank it while it was still warm, which is a small habit I am trying to build and keep failing at. And I thought this time I might have managed it. That's where Clara's story leaves me. Not with a triumph, not with a complete account, with a beginning, and the careful work of something being rebuilt. Thank you for listening to this story with me. If it stayed with you, if it made you think about your own family, or the way love gets expressed in the language people don't always say out loud, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if you're not subscribed yet, please do. Every story on this channel is made with the same care. I'll see you in the next one.